I kind of feel the today's topic in terms of the political economy of competition law, while a bit of a mouthful, is for me, I think the zeitgeist. It is, I think, one of the key issues of 2021. And I felt this was a great subject to sort of start the year off because I think we're going to have so much coming back to it and so much as a reference point. So, Robin, I kind of, when we talked about how this would go, I sort of said it's conversational, it's a group discussion, but I thought it'd be fair if you wanted to lead us off, both in terms of what attracts you. What is it about competition law that, given all the many things that you are interested in that you could do, why this area? And why the political economy of competition law? Because before you sort of said that to me, I admit I'd never thought about it, but it instantly became a self-evident, of course, yes, that makes total sense. So I'm curious to hear both, how you got to competition law and why you think political economy is such an essential way of approaching the area.
Yeah. Hi everyone again. It's great to see so many faces. We're not seeing a lot of those these days, so good to meet everyone. Um, yeah, so I got into the topic of competition policy and law, like through my training in economics. So I did my undergrad and master's in economics. I'm like a total econ nerd. And in my master's, I developed a real interest in the economics around competition policy. And I took courses and did training so that I could work at the Competition Bureau, which is Canada's competition law enforcement agency. So that's like the FTC and the DOJ in the US. So I took courses. I got a job at the Competition Bureau, and it was kind of my dream job. I wanted to do this work because I thought, well, I mean, this is going to help me help people, right? And that's something that I really value in my work. But when I got there, I had a kind of a crisis of faith, crisis of economics faith, because I got there and realized, like, oh man, like, these people are just on a total other wavelength than me. Like, I don't understand why we're not talking about people and the impact of business conduct on people. Because in my mind and, in my schooling, like, this is what I envisioned and imagined. And I began to realize that, this really isn't the focus of our system in Canada. Our system of competition policy in Canada cares very little about consumers. Instead, it's based off of this philosophy that competition policy is all about economic efficiency. And I'm hearing more and more of this especially in the United States, right? People are more tuned into this idea that, like, there's a philosophy or even an ideology of competition policy that says that competition law and policy, antitrust, is not about helping consumers. Rather, it's about creating an efficient economy. And so, I've having worked at the Competition Bureau doing reviews of mergers, I began to understand how this philosophy impacted the way that we regulate businesses and the very nature of the laws we have. I'm seeing a lot more people critical of this perspective in the US, and people are pushing back against it. But I don't think people really understand just how deep this thinking is in our system, in part because we don't really talk about our system all that much. So I actually, like, I had a moment, straw that broke the camel's back moment, where I was doing a review around payday loan companies. So there was a transaction between payday loan companies that was reviewable. So we reviewed it. And, just seeing, like, honestly, just like contempt, like it to me, it looked like contempt for poor people. And, maybe, other people would debate that, but that's what I saw. And it disgusted me. It just disgusted me. And I thought, like, I don't want to do this. Why would I want to perpetuate a system and a set of laws that, have that baked into it. And so I quit. And like, honest to God, like I thought leaving that job, like I need to retrain. Like I had, done 5-6 years of education to get to this point, and I realized like am I even cut out for this? Can I even be an economist? Like, I'm totally serious, like total crisis of faith and self-esteem, right? Because being in an environment where you feel so different from people, and like your perspectives are not really valued, or like you just don't see that connection, like you start to feel a little crazy. And so I left that and tried to, find other ways to, contribute and, find an occupation that, aligned with me. But I came back to this topic of competition policy. I kept coming back to it, trying to understand my experience there and trying to understand why things are the way they are. And it drove me to like finally just, apply to do a PhD at Carleton in public policy. And that's my dissertation topic. So I'm unpacking this idea that competition policy is all about efficiency. And to do that, I'm bringing like some data-driven methods, but also, like Jesse was saying, bringing that political economy approach, right? Because at the end of the day, you can't talk about competition unless you talk about power and dominance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and I mean, it's interesting, the way in which you describe that stuff is remarkably accessible. And, I always found that the areas that are highly regulated, banking, telecom, the language makes it so difficult, so abstract, so kind of obfuscated. And competition law is kind of the same. That there is this veneer as if it's sort of the public interest or benefiting people. But to your point, it's about market efficiencies, which actually just benefit dominant market players rather than, the actual general participants. So I'm fascinated by the idea that competition law itself should be much more accessible, but that there's a power dynamic, that there's a political economy, especially in this era of monopoly, because it does feel, and this is what I also really liked about your op-ed, it does feel as if, a huge opportunity was missed, a negligence from a regulatory authority perspective. Vass put a question in the chat. What about when people conflate monopoly and oligopoly? Which I think is equally a fascinating question. So I'm curious, Robin, for you to elaborate on that and elaborate on how you, from a public policy perspective, how would you like to see competition law retooled or reconfigured so that it actually could start addressing, because I think the moral crisis you went through, I think reflects popular opinion. I think most people mistakenly think that the Competition Bureau's job is to protect us, when, in fact, as you're saying, it's quite the opposite.
Yeah. So, okay, before I answer Vass's question, I want a bit of an elaboration. Can you elaborate? What do you mean by conflate monopoly and oligopoly?
Okay, so to Jesse's point around how like the literature, the policy, the processes are almost intentionally inaccessible to the average person, right? Like oligopoly.
Yeah.
I don't even know how to pronounce it properly. I know the word. I know the concept. I honestly, like, not trying to be
that's right.
But sometimes with competition policy, like it seems a body of literature that suggests, competition policy is designed to deal with monopolies, and a lot of the concentration in certain industries is, 3 companies that may or may not be colluding, or that kind of can conveniently collude. So thus we should, either make certain amendments or work to recognize these oligopolies. How do you say it?
Yeah. That's it.
Thank you. Yes. Like when you read a word a lot, but it's your first time saying it out loud, there should be a word for that. Yeah, is it fair to say with telecoms, is that a monopoly? Or like, is that just a semantic thing that we maybe want people to get tripped up on? Or is that something that, companies can sort of pantomime competition when really there's not. And maybe that's more of my question. I'm not elaborating on it. I don't know. Is that helpful? You're nodding, which is
No,
so nice. I'm
yeah.
just mute myself.
No, okay, I get it. So there's lots of jargon, right? So like monopoly, which means like complete domination, right? So like when there's only one place you can go to buy, something like that, that retailer is a monopoly, right? Oligopoly, like Bass, you were saying, is when you have a small number of competitors, right? But what makes monopolies and oligopolies so, competitors, what makes them so dangerous to both people but also the economy is that they have market power. So that's really a key concept behind all competition policy. It's this idea that without competition, businesses have power and they can exert that power in order to reinforce their place within the market, or just get benefits from that, right? So when you have a small number of grocers that can wink, wink, nudge, nudge each other to reduce hero pay for grocery store workers, they are exerting market power to their benefit. They can do those things because they have market power. And in particular, they have that market power by colluding, by coming together and agreeing to something, right? And so you can see there, by making that agreement amongst each other, they gain market power, which then enables them to reduce pay for workers. So that's like an example, right? Like telecom's another example where you have a small number of players, and because there's a small number, it's easier for the marketing teams of these large organizations to get really sophisticated in how they track prices, and they engage in complex pricing strategies against one another. But oftentimes these strategies evolve into tacit collusion. That's another jargon term. So it may not be explicit collusion, right, where they sit down, make an agreement, sign it, and okay, this is what we're going to do. But rather, it's this tacit understanding that, TELUS increased their prices for mobile services in this community. I, as Bell, can do the same, right? Or I know that there are certain rhythms or systems of pricing that I can mirror. You see that in gas prices as well. And I don't know if this is the case anymore because there's been a lot of enforcement activity in that. But like research has shown, like empirically, that there are pricing, I guess the word is maybe like traditions or systems where gas prices cycle on a 2-week cycle, and prices are highest on a Thursday, and then they stay high throughout the weekend, and then they continue to drop through the 2 weeks, and then they go up on another Thursday. And so because there's like these industry standards or norms, you can have oligopolies creating and exerting market power. But even just the fact that there are fewer options, right? As a consumer, if you don't have a lot of places to go for the goods and services you need, you're likely going to be subject to market power. Well, and that can also work in the other direction when it comes to workers. Anyway, go ahead, Jesse.
Well, I was going to say I think myth I've always had when it comes to competition law is the barrier to entry. And I think of this partly from a consumer perspective, in that it's not just my choice amongst people in the market. And this is where technology kind of comes in. The belief that a new entrant can enter the market at any time and disrupt the marketplace. Now, Brian in the chat asked the question of what is the government's attitude towards applying different standards and scrutiny depending on the size of a company. And that to me kind of ties to the notion of barriers to entry. That is there within competition law consideration that the marketplace should be accessible, that there should be provision so that not just that there's competition between existing entrants, but that new entrants at any time should not have obstacles in way of them being able to enter the market, hence small businesses and the way in which small businesses, in theory, should or should not be in the same marketplace as much larger entities.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple ways to unpack that. I think like the first thing to kind of highlight, like you said, there's a myth in Canada that our system is intended to benefit consumers. And perhaps in some aspects of our system that might be the case, but overall, I think that is a myth, right? Now, to the question of applying different standards and scrutiny depending on the size of a company, that's a super interesting question. So, in Canada, you cannot block a merger just because it's a merger to monopoly. So what that means is, okay, say like Jesse and I are two businesses and we decide to, merge, and Jesse's going to buy my business, and my business is, the transaction's going to be worth $100 million. So this means that the transaction needs to be, there's a notifiability requirement. So I need to go to the Competition Bureau and fill out some forms that say I'm doing this. And then the Competition Bureau reviews that merger. So say Jesse and I have we sell the same product and we're the only people that sell it. It's like this exotic widget that just doesn't exist anywhere else. So we're creating a merger to monopoly. The Competition Bureau can't go to the Competition Tribunal, which is the special court that hears these cases, and say, hey, we need an injunction to block this transaction because it's creating a monopoly. And it's a semantic point, but it's an important point. Rather, the argument that the Commissioner of Competition needs to make is that this merger is going to reduce competition. And that is a different set of evidence, right? Market structure or market shares, they're a part of that. But in order to show that Jesse and I are going to merge and then, cause problems according to the law, the competition commissioner needs to show that we're going to increase prices or we're going to undermine innovation. Those are kind of the two main yardsticks that things are evaluated by. And this is really important because it is much, much harder to show hypothetically that some transaction is going to lead to higher prices than it is to show, hey, if I have 50% of the market and Jesse has 50% of the market, if we merge, it's 100% of the market. Like, it's just easy math, right? So this comes back to, our point about the myth, right? The myth in our competition policy system comes from the way that the law is structured and the different legal tests that are applied to different types of business conduct that identifies whether they're illegal or not. So if you have these simple rule of thumb measures, right, like market share, it's much easier to block mergers or stop businesses from acting in anti-competitive ways. But if you have to meet these complex legal standards that require all sorts of evidence and like tons of economic and business experts being hauled into court and affidavits all over the place, like, it's very difficult to create a law that actually prevents anti-competitive behavior. So, is there different standards of scrutiny depending on the size of a company? No, and that's a problem.
Well, and it strikes me, and I'll credit you with this, in that I again had never thought of this until speaking with you the first time, but it strikes me that part of the obfuscation or part of the lack of scrutiny, the opaqueness of competition law, is the way in which morality is present and yet invisible. Because to say that, the goal is efficient markets, well, that's a moral statement. That's saying that you believe in markets as the ultimate governor of human activity versus, I think part of your reaction, part of my reaction is, I have a different morality, right? I want to see fairness. I want to see protection. I want to see, greater transparency, for example. So to what extent does there need to be either an explicit morality, which I sort of hear in the phrase political economy, or to what extent does the existing morality need to be teased out so it can be critiqued, in that if competition law focuses on market efficiency, and we're increasingly finding markets, especially in the wake of a pandemic, being grossly inefficient, then there needs to be a rethinking of either the broader philosophy or the frame in which competition law takes place. Thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think like both your comments are right. There needs to be an explicit morality and philosophy behind competition policy, and the implicit morality of our current system needs to be teased out. And I think that's one of the key things that's missing in current conversation about competition policy in Canada. I mean, besides the fact that we don't really talk about it, right? And, you know, in kind of thinking about this conversation and like kind of brainstorming a bit, like I think like at its most fundamental level, when we think about competition policy, we need to ask ourselves, what role does competition have as like a human behavior, right? Like something that people do, right? What role does that behavior have in our economy and society, right? Because I think it's wrong to say, and I think many people that do competition law would argue that competition is inherently good. We want a competitive economy. Well, I don't know about that. I mean, I think that there are places in economy and society where you don't want competition, right? Like, you know, people talk about the like marketization of social spheres, right? Like the market for, you know, spouses, right? Like, do we really want to be like finding life partners through a competitive process? Like, you know, fight to the death, like, or, you know, hey, whoever wins the sprinting contest is going to marry me. No, like we don't do that. Right. But that mechanism can actually be kind of useful for other contexts, right? Like innovation, right? Like I see you doing something, I'm going to one up you. Oh, you're doing that, I'm going to one up you. Or, you know, keeping healthy prices, right? Oh, you are lowering your prices and capturing some of my consumers. Well, I'm going to do the same to you. And so that rivalry can be healthy, right? But competition policy needs to ask itself, how much of that rivalry do we want and where do we want it? And so I think that's the political economy side of things. And in Canada, we've made a decision to undermine that rivalry in order to have economies of scale. So what I mean by that is, in Canada, especially when it comes to mergers, and Vass asked the question, merger versus acquisition, same thing. So merger and acquisition, or together, M&A. So we allow mergers that are going to undermine competition if those businesses can show that the transaction is going to cut costs, right? And the idea being that you can cut some of these overhead costs and then reduce the per unit cost of the widget you're making, or, you know, whatever else you're producing. So if Jesse, you and I merge and we have a, you know, a staff of 200 people, and I fire 50 people because I have 50 admin people and I'm just going to keep your admin people, that's acceptable under Canadian law. We have a provision in our legislation that says if Jesse and I merge, that merger is very likely going to hurt consumers, so increase prices. But Robin fires 50 people, then that's A-okay. Mm-hmm. And so we've made a choice, a political choice, to prioritize those types of efficiencies over the welfare of consumers. So, like, I think in order to like get that straight, we need to start talking about the fundamentals, right? Like, what role does competition have in our economy? And I think that flexibility also, like, it gives us a, you know, more tools to work with, or, you know, more paints in the paint palette or whatever, because, you know, it lets us say, well, you know, maybe the telecoms shouldn't have competition. Maybe they should be nationalized. I don't know. Mm-hmm. Like, does competition work? Right? Mm-hmm. I don't know. Maybe we should just buy them. I mean, I don't know if I believe that or not, but I think it's a legitimate argument.
Well, and I think it's a legitimate debate, because I think part of the paradox is this has to come from the political level, right? This has to come from the elected officials, and they respond to public opinion and public debate. So there first has to be a quasi-spontaneous public discourse about competition law, which ironically I do think is happening, right? On a small scale, as a result of what's happening in the United States, as a result of the dominance of the digital giants in our lives. So I feel, the relevance of this conversation is that it is very au courant, but I still feel that we are an elite who desire for this conversation to scale up, but the civil society infrastructure on this particular issue may not be there. Because this was another subject I wanted to talk about in terms of, whether it's other areas of social justice, there is some civil society infrastructure. There are researchers and organizations, and even in the realm of economy, there's the CCPA. And this is usually the time of year where, they have one of their big hits in terms of CEO pay, where they do their campaign about how most Canadian CEOs have earned more now in the first few days of the year than most workers will all year. But the competition law file seems not like, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of people working it. Now, I'm curious, and this is where Jeanette, I don't know if you had your hand up earlier or if you were just resting your face.
No, I did.
So I'm curious to bring you in. I'm curious anyone else who wants to jump in. And I'm throwing this open both for you guys to jump in the conversation as you see fit, but with me raising the meta question of how is this conversation spread? How is the participation in the policy around competition, around governance of markets? Because I think it's ultimately the governance of the digital giants and the governance of our economic infrastructure on a digital level. I think competition law is where a lot of that's going to play out. So how do we make this a more participatory and inclusive policy area? I raise that as a meta, but Jeanette, by all means, take this in a completely different direction.
I really just wanted to, my experience of thinking about these issues has nothing to do with markets or companies or businesses. It's got to do with the professions, right? But specifically healthcare professions. And monopoly means something different in that context. That doesn't mean it's necessarily a positive thing, but I think there's a different point of view about what the value of that is. And there are different arguments to be made. And it's, when Robin was talking about this larger question of, is competition the value that we want governing every aspect of our lives? I thought, okay, well, this is an arena where, we're looking at a lot of the same kinds of issues, but they have been framed differently. I would argue that the professions actually have been remarkably successful at selling the idea that monopoly is good, that monopoly is what protects us from quack doctors, and that, some of that even collusion is a good thing, because again, it's somehow presented as being in the public interest. That was really all I wanted to add.
But a fascinating point in terms of especially the issue of credibility amidst the pandemic, whether those arguments in favor of their monopoly undermine their ability to mobilize public health and mobilize public response, because they've relied upon their institutional authority rather than developing a more a relational authority, a more cognitive authority.
Well, and that's where, so much energy is wasted by these professions in the scope of practice arguments, the jurisdictional battles over, where does the line end for, like, let's say ophthalmology versus optometrists versus, opticians who are totally beyond the pale because they don't have a degree. You see that play out, all over healthcare, the nurse practitioners versus the regular RNs, anyway.
I mean, David, this is kind of the part of the trenches you've been in as a PhD in the field of medicine, trying to get MDs and other disciplines to work together and collaborate more. Is this a point in which you'd like to jump into the conversation?
I'm not sure.
All right, Mike.
I was going down another avenue of query that maybe I would save for towards the end of our conversation.
Okay, fair enough. Mike, you've been sort of jumping in the chat when it comes to the telecom stuff, because of course you're very much in favor of monopoly.
That's the only thing I know about. So right, yeah. So and I've taken I take positions from here, you know, and right now, I mean, I would say that when you're looking for people that understand this monopoly thing, Canadians, because you know we're all racist, are looking in the wrong place. Indigenous people have been dealing with like especially the North. I was lucky enough to move up there right when I got out of school and found out that all it was is for-profit monopolies that are subsidized by the government, right? So that's the most fucked up thing you could ever have in society. So it's built up over the years because the people that wrote the rules, and so you have these three horrible places. This is on YouTube, Iqaluit, Yellowknife, and Whitehorse that run, you know, the government, you know, and funnel money, like the money sort of goes down the pipeline, but it all, for some reason over the years, it's gotten to this place where some business guy in the 90s or the 80s or the 70s, maybe even 5 years ago, set up a business, and then his rights to make money forever trumped everybody that lived there. And you get this at a local level, right up to, you know, I'm not that critical of Northwest Tel, who's the monopoly operator over there, because honestly, people in the Northwest Territories and Yukon have a really good internet. In Nunavut, it's horrible because everything's on satellite, and so it's complicated, and that's why I always sort of show both sides. But as a fundamental thing, when you're talking about the government, they're the ones that's the problem in the North, right? So as far as competition, who needs competition is the territorial governments need competition from the Inuit and Dene governments, and they're not allowed to because you know, and the feds and the provinces are protecting these subsidized monopolies, and subsidized monopolies are a horrible thing. So if they're not, you know, highly regulated. So so I do know about a specific situation that's like, but I think that Indigenous people in the country know this problem clearly, at least in the North, we know it.
Well, and you, I think, you indirectly sort of evoked the, you know, what about competition between governments and among governments and non-government entities? Because on the one hand, I think Indigenous nations across the country are increasingly in a competitive relationship with the federal government, and you're just outlining the economic aspects. But then, of course, we have the threat.
I mean, it used to be like torture.
Right.
Now but they actually get just treated horribly.
But so. You're also evoking, you know, and we don't, I believe, have any representation present, the blockchain libertarian nuts who sort of see their own kind of competition with traditional government services as part of what they, you know, believe in, right?
Or Elon Musk, if we're just going to keep it in telecom.
I was going to say
Elon Musk is a telecom version of a blockchain nut, right? He's losing massive amounts of money, able to come in over the top, somehow get this telecom license and operate. If Bell Canada was losing or offering a service at 1/5 of what it costs to provide, people would go crazy and say, "Oh, you guys are horrible," and they can't do that. But somehow, Elon Musk, our hero, is able to do whatever the hell he wants. You know, and get cheerleaded for it by all these blockchain idiots.
I set that up only to establish the idea that competition is as a metaphor running rampant, even though I think Robin's original provocation that maybe we should rethink when and where competition is appropriate. So allow me to throw to you, Stro, because in the chat you were sort of suggesting you wanted to make the argument as to the merits of competition or the inherent pervasiveness of competition as a kind of state of nature.
Yes, I just think it's natural. I think that, you know, we're in a competition to change the system, and it's David versus Goliath, but it's still a competition, like, because nothing is absolute, and at some point, the yin and the yang of it has to come around. Like, we have to change the system because there's enough problems being created by lack of competition in a way, because it's the powers that be have gone too big and too pervasive in our lives, right? So we're the little ball in the, you know, in the bigger scheme of things, in competition with this big entity. But I think everything, when you break it down, becomes this duality of versus something, right? So I think there's always an innate competition, whether we're looking for partners or we're dealing with economics or politics or anything else. Is what I'm not saying it's right. I think we have to think about um, how are we gonna, if we're gonna survive as a species, what are we really competing against, and how we go about this competition. And I totally agree. We should never put property rights ahead of human rights, but it seems like the competition has come down to, okay, we're in a fight for our lives versus people owning things as opposed to our own nature. And I think that's the big challenge is how do we make the competition benevolent for everybody, because it doesn't seem to be working that way.
I mean, I saw facial reactions from Sharita, Jeanette, and Vass that all seemed like you wanted to respond. So any of you, by all means, jump in.
Vass, you want to go first?
I think my face was reacting to, I don't know, I was just thinking like, are there ways to like start a company online without using the infrastructure of Shopify, right? Because Shopify is a company that I think is well on its way to becoming monopolistic, which I think would be incredible for Canada's economy. And we're all kind of watching it happen in real time. And its growth is something we could learn from these, belated anti-competitive tactics in the US. So that was my only kind of thing, Greg. I was like, okay, thinking about like the not Amazon kind of mini movement. I'm forgetting the woman's name who started it, who's Toronto based, people, consumers thinking about alternatives and what consumer power we have, when really the most powerful lever that we have as consumers is probably mobilizing around antitrust action, and not feeling badly or shaming ourselves too if we engage in and with the companies that are causing the, for lack of a better phrase, because I think it's so imprecise, harms. But Jeanette, I want to hear more from you, and I love your toque, so it's your turn.
It's cold here. My reaction, and this is in no way personal, Greg, it's just that my hackles go up the minute I hear appeals to some sort of state of nature and the naturalization of competition as an inescapable fact of human society. I mean, that's a myth that's really convenient for people who are invested in a sort of possessive individualism where, I wrestled away from you your stuff, so it's mine now. Or I mixed my labor with this land, so it's mine now. I won the competition. But I don't think I'm alone. There's quite a lot of major thinkers who would argue cooperation and collaboration is as endemic and is as much a natural, let's say, facet of human society, maybe even more so. That if anything is the hallmark of human society, it's cooperation. What's the popular myth? It's absolutely the idea that every man for himself. It's always every man for himself too.
Yeah, I agree. I think that cooperation is really. I think what I was trying to imply is that I agree that cooperation is why we have survived as a species. I think the problem is that cooperation is in competition with that old way of thinking, or that the way that we've seen nature get us to this point, right? Like, so cooperation, this, what we're talking about, this being, that's why we have laws, right? That's why we have things in society, and things, I feel like we've almost gone backwards because capitalism have made things too competitive, and we need to step back from that and actually go after the cooperative, the more common good model for how we run business and how we run politics. And I think, or whatever it is, right? And I think we can't forget that what we're up against is competitive. Like, it's still a competition. How are we going to win the competition to make cooperation and collaboration the way we move forward? Because I don't think we're going to be able to survive as a species and save ourselves and this planet if we don't. So we kind of have to understand our competitor in a way, right? Because you're right, that's exactly the problem with the world.
Sharita,
I have a.
Sorry, go ahead, Robin.
I was going to say, I have a question or follow up to Greg's point there. So, and this is something I've been thinking about. I don't have an answer for it. But, like, if I understand right, your argument or what you're saying is that, we ought to move to a way of doing things as a society that's more cooperative, right? So, what makes the grocery store collusions to suppress wages bad? Like that's cooperation, that's collaboration.
I think it's bad because it's, again, not taking the human aspect of it and putting it ahead of the economic gain for even though they're big, the philosophy behind it is bad because it's not for the greater good. And it's not cooperative because you're not cooperating with the people you're directly dealing with. So, again, I don't think the competition is that small. I think it's actually a bigger competition of how do we change our system of economics and political structure that is driven by property, by capitalism, right? Owning capital and making that dollar more important than what the effect on those people is going to be. So how do we compete against them?
Well,
I don't know.
Right.
And I think Greg, aka Stroh, deserves credit in that he's literally attempting the meta view, which is, even when trying to go past competition, there's a certain competition that one has
Right.
to deal with those who demand competition, right?
Correct.
Who are not going to necessarily sit and negotiate with you on the terms that you desire, which I think is the point of political economy. That you acknowledge power and you acknowledge money and the way in which power and money relate to each other and change the dynamic in which the rules or the laws take place. Now, Sharita, you had your virtual hand up, and I suspect you wanted to sort of take it in that political economy direction.
I did. And what keeps running around in my head is, yes, monopoly is power. And what that power can often mean is exclusive access. Now, access to what? You can talk about it on all kinds of different levels. We were talking about it in terms of, regulated health professionals, etc. But what it also means to the general public is access to information and access to knowledge. Now, it really suits people who are in positions of power to really put the clamps on which people have access to what they know, right, to their power. So really, when you're looking at monopoly, you have to break it down more in terms of the political economy. And I know I'm coming at it from a very high level instead of looking at it in terms of competition or collaboration, etc. But I really think we have to unpack it at the level of power and access to power and access to knowledge and access to money. So basically that's what I wanted to say, because it works on all kinds of levels.
Well, and, this goes to something Vass was saying about worker-owned co-ops in the chat, that I've been thinking a lot about the government money that's being spent in response to the pandemic. And a lot of that money is going to large companies to remain large companies. Mm-hmm. And it wouldn't be difficult to allocate a tiny amount of that towards startups, towards, co-ops, towards sole proprietorships, right? And to really make that, which goes back to my earlier point of the myth that I used to subscribe to, that competition law was about access to the marketplace and lowering barrier to entry. Because even though I do have my own kind of critical tendencies around market economics, I have this romanticism of entrepreneurship, that it's great when someone feels a sense of agency and feels as if they can participate in the economy in a meaningful way, but it has to be accessible. It has to be something that they're able to access. And that may be the myth of digital tools, that digital tools make us think that you can start a business and go online and make money. But to Vass's point, maybe you're just making money for Shopify, right? And maybe you're just stuck in the multi-level marketing that is Shopify or Amazon or Twitch or any of these platforms. And maybe that's why Shopify should be nationalized. Maybe that's why some of these platforms should be nationalized, because if you're ultimately working for them, well, maybe they should be working for us as society. So as the platform grows, society grows and tax revenue grows, and therefore education and healthcare grows. And that's where I think when we go back to Robin's earlier provocation of maybe we should be rethinking competition and the role that it plays in our lives, which I think we've been doing in this discussion in terms of cooperation and monopoly and regulation. I think what we're tapping into is the richness of this area and the extent to which it ought to be a much more active public conversation. Jeanette, you're itching to get in?
No, I was actually just I was responding to the chat because Vass had put up this thing about, is the pandemic offering a boost to monopolies, yes or no? And I was thinking, well, going back to professional monopolies, those guys, their bread and butter is the arguments for stability and security and safety, right? That's the justification for policing those jurisdictions. And pandemic, is going to make those arguments that much more powerful. So I would vote yes, absolutely. Now I don't have to type that anymore.
See, I keep thinking about, competition can be really great, like in sport, right? But there's a set of rules, and there's generally a benefit to being in the competition, like the Olympic spirit, right? And I think if we scale that up, we haven't got an Olympic spirit when it comes to the way the world runs their politics and their economics. It seems to be a blood sport a lot more than any other sport. And I think that's what we need to change, is the philosophy behind competition. I think there needs to be a social safety net, right? And that's gone away because monopolies and competitors just want to blow everybody. Just they want to fight to the death and not let the little guy coexist and play in their beer league. They treat it all as the professional sport, and it shouldn't be that way. And I think that's where we need to change about competition, is the philosophy behind it, when it comes to things that matter to people to survive. And would we be having this conversation if there was no injustice in the world? I don't know.
But
right?
But maybe this is the point about rules. Like, we're having a discussion about competition law because we kind of agree there ought to be rules, right? There ought to be a way in which people can be in the marketplace. And maybe I'm crazy in the sense that, like, if I had a small business that made me enough money that allowed me to feed myself, house myself, and live the lifestyle that I'm currently living right now, which, again, is not in any way affluent or opulent, I would not need more. Like, this idea that businesses have to grow and grow and win. There's a toxicity to that culture that could be recorded in rules. Like, you could have zero taxes if your business has 100,000 revenue, but over 100,000 revenue, 50% taxes, or something crazy that just and maybe that's not the threshold. But it's this idea that we could be using rules to foster a different culture that harness the power of competition, but still recognized how cooperation and the greater good is what makes human society possible. Now, And I sort of said that in response, Vass, to your point about what's the second place or what's the silver medal for competition. And I was like, well, right. Why don't we have a participant medal in business? You survived the pandemic. You didn't go bankrupt. Congratulations. Rather than the always, you must conquer and you must win it all. I mean, again, I think that there's much more room for the type of competition that still allows for a much more human, a much more reasonable approach to the economy. Other thoughts, other directions that we want to take the conversation? Mike, by all means, jump in.
I just want to say something just to make sure I understand it, because I think what you just sort of said is Robin's main point, is that nobody's really looking at the rules, and the rules are what's mad, like, right? And so it's like we're always sort of looking at who the outcomes of the system, and they, you know, they're winning there, and that's no good, and this is stupid. But no one's like looking at the rules and say, like, what are they, and how does it actually end up? Because, and I think that's where, you know, there's a little more, like Nunavut particularly is a weird place because there's this active political participation at the municipalities. Yeah. In the Inuit group or Dene and NWT, that as well as the territorial government and the federal government, and it's just 1,000 people in the middle of nowhere trying to like keep costs down, and everything's the opposite. Everyone's trying to grow their profits on those people. Like it's, and this is just sort of built up over these weird rules. So you know, it's just, I think it's all about the rules, and I think. To me, you made me, and that's why I just want to summarize because I'm, you know, I didn't really spend much time at school, so I always just take the thing I know, and then, but I think that's it, is that what Robin's thesis is that why aren't people like looking at the rules and saying, like, asking all these questions about it? You know, that's how I sort of take it.
Mike, you know, I'm just going to reply to that because I have this thought that just came to my mind, is that the rules were there, but you know, somebody won the competition and they thought they could change the rules, and so the rules have been changed by the people that win because they wanted to continue to win, right? So it's like it doesn't make sense anymore. There are no rules because the people that have won have changed the rules, right? If it used to be the UN, for example. Well, that was run by the U.S. because they had the biggest in guns, or the biggest posse or whatever, and they took over and changed the rules, and now we're all up against it.
Vass, you were sort of shaking your head there.
Oh, I'm just being like a good participant. No, I mean, look, maybe we don't have time for it, but I'd love to maybe also brainstorm, like, how can we have more monopoly? Because I think thought experiments like that help us understand where the levers are and where the opportunities are that need to be kind of remedied, as we're talking about, like the rules need to change, or they've been, you know, they're acting in the interests of the wrong actors, or they're just kind of ignoring things. Like Sarah, to your points, you're right. We have to be learning from these major cases. And again, we probably don't have time now, maybe a future meta views, or maybe something to leave you guys with, or we have in the chat, but I'm personally interested in trying to think that through. Robin, I'm sure you have 1,000 ideas, but if that's our goal, that's like, just, again, yeah, a nice way to work backwards and be like, here are some areas of opportunity for more education and discussion.
See, I think that in and of itself, that was provocative. I think the idea that we could have a conversation of what are some good monopolies, or what should we nationalize? Even if it's just a thought experiment, right? I'm not sure that we could have that conversation in public. That we're having it now because there's a certain culture here that we all want to explore the ideas. But if you floated that on social media, right, and that's what I think is fascinating about the idea. Now, Sarah, you've been typing stuff in the chat, which has been very, which has been excellent. Do you want to take a moment in our last few minutes to participate verbally and add your own perspective or 2 cents?
Well, I think Vass's response is really good, that, you know, if we had good examples, we wouldn't have big tech. And so I thought that was really helpful. I was just thinking, you know, I found the op-ed really provocative and really helpful, you know, to read through. And I think this discussion has been great. But, you know, I was kind of hoping that at the end you know, maybe there are some good things to think about. How can we leave on, you know, a positive note of, if there aren't good examples out here, how can we be the good examples? And, how do we move in that direction? So I don't know, maybe Robin, if you have some closing words on, how we can look ahead, where we go from here, basically, that would be great.
Yeah. Well, one thing that, an idea that Vass gave me was, I'd like to do more like an informal reading group. So something I'd like to do is, get a group of people like this group together and actually work through some of the regulatory documents of Canada's competition policy system. And I know, like, on surface, that sounds so dry. And part of my motivation of doing it is like actually motivating myself to do it because it is dry. But I think by like coming together and talking about it and really understanding, we are empowered to do something about it. I think like another positive action we can take. Well, I'll back up and say, I think that the positive step forward in all of this is to take some action, right? I don't see a lot of really good feel-good stories when it comes to Canada competition policy. Maybe there are a couple, right? But I can't really think of any. So I think the feel-good like inspiration that we can take away from this is that, we've come to this conversation and have left it, I think, with a bit more insight and perhaps a bit more motivation to talk about these things and bring people into the conversation and share these ideas in an accessible way that's not all technobabble. So that's, I think, if you're interested in engaging on the issue, I think the best thing you can do is start talking about it.
Well, and I think that's
hopefully that felt good.
But I think
that's the spot, Sarah.
I think that's part of the magic of these chats that before I first chatted with you, Robin, while I sort of had a sense of competition law, it was not something I would have talked about publicly. And yet now I do feel both a sense of empowerment that nobody else knows what they're talking about. So therefore I'm perfectly entitled to talk about competition law. And I think there's a certain accessibility to that will hopefully foster this broader policy conversation. Neil, David, Murley, the three of you guys, Brian, haven't really weighed in the conversation all. Now's your last chance if there's anything pressing that you'd like to contribute or like to add.
I think the thing to recognize, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Brian.
Oh, I think the thing to recognize is that it's always, everything is constantly evolving. Like, so something that worked well as a competitive effort, it'll reach a point and then, let's, I don't know, like, not like, let's clamp down on it. Like, I think, and I think people need to be more comfortable with that, and
David?
Oh, I was just hoping that Robin had found balm for her soul in her studies at Carleton and fellow travelers in the exploration of this conundrum that we're in there as well.
Neil, you unmuted?
Yes, thank you. There's a dynamic, a continuum between competition and cooperation. And so I think what we're doing is we're moving back and forth along that continuum. And I'm thinking, for instance, about the United States and Canada, because in the United States, competition has become toxic and they can't even talk to each other. So what we need in a democracy is we need healthy competition where, for instance, Jesse and I might differ in a respectful way, but at some point we come to an agreement so that we can then cooperate to achieve a goal. And I think Saskatchewan has been a pretty good example of that in Canada. And it's partly because they have been small and generally oppressed. And so they have figured out a lot of successful strategies to succeed. And we have to thank Saskatchewan for our medical system. So obviously it's a good thing. So we're all beneficiaries of cooperation. And I think we have to keep that in mind. And so these people that Jesse, you're referencing that are just competition for competition's sake. I think that comes from the militaristic, Eurocentric point of view, where you have to crush the enemy at all costs. And in the United States, it's become crush the enemy even at the cost of your own demise. And this is very sad to see. But because we can be a contrast to that, because, for instance, our illness and death rates are significantly less per capita, I think we're demonstrating that competition can be achieved. And the United States is learning a very, very hard lesson in that regard. So from the Competition Bureau point of view, I'm really saddened to think that a Competition Bureau's goal is not to protect the consumer. But if it isn't, then it's up to us. And so we have to individually do what we can. And we have to kind of be smart enough and due diligence enough to figure out how to take care of ourselves. And at some point, we have to try to make the best possible decisions that we can.
Right on. We are effectively out of time, although no one really has to go anywhere. I was going to say any last words, but before I say last words, allow me to acknowledge Vass had her hand up before I said any last words. Oh, okay. Fair enough. Any last words? Anyone who'd like to add their perspective or thoughts before we wrap things up? I mean, I think this has been a fascinating conversation. I think Vass sort of said to Robin in the chat, you should do some type of pop-up class or course, which I would concur. I feel this has been a tremendous value to me, really empowering me to rethink of competition law as something that I should be more concerned about, and that I should feel entitled to weigh in about and engage people about. I hope all of you feel the same. Today's session, I think, really, for me, reinforces the value of these salons, both as a knowledge mobilization vehicle so that we can all learn, but also to get to know each other and get a sense of who's in this network, because that is really its fundamental purpose, is for us to learn and to grow and to be more politically active around the issues that each of us individually think are really important and pressing. So I encourage you to come back next Tuesday. Still not sure what the time or the subject or the focus will be, but it will probably be just as entertaining and informative, or closely to today's session. I encourage you all to follow Robin on Twitter. She posted her email there, or email address there in the chat. And I think these issues are something that we will certainly cover more in MetaViews moving forward. But I encourage all of you guys to send me suggestions on what you would like to see in a salon, both in terms of whether you'd want to lead one, or selfishly that you just want to participate in one, and it's a subject that is pressing and is of interest to you in general. But other than that, thanks again, Robin. That was fantastic. And thanks everybody for showing up and hanging out.
So great to meet everyone.